It all started on a quiet spring morning in the neighborhood, when I noticed HOA Karen pacing back and forth in her perfectly manicured yard, glaring at my modest little garden. She had been the self-appointed watchdog of rules, regulations, and aesthetics, forever ready to pounce on anyone daring to color outside the HOA lines. This time her target wasn't my garden gnomes, my fence height, or even my patio furniture. It was my Springwater collection. Yes, I had a small setup of barrels and containers, carefully catching and storing rainwater from my roof and a nearby natural spring. It wasn't just about convenience. I liked the idea of sustainable living, but to Karen, it was a threat, an act of defiance, and perhaps a personal insult. She stormed over, arms flailing, as I watered my tulips. "You can't just hoard water like that," she shouted, voice cracking somewhere between fury and hysteria. "It's against the HOA rules. That water belongs to the community." I nearly choked on my tea. "It belongs to me because it's on my property," I replied calmly, smiling at the absurdity of the situation. "I catch rain that falls on my roof and spring water that flows through my land. How exactly does that violate any rule?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a clipboard as if it were a weapon, flipping through pages of HOA guidelines she clearly hadn't read entirely. Her eyes darted between my barrels, my flower beds, and my small fountain. This is unacceptable. I'm calling a meeting and you will explain yourself." I watched her stomp away, heels clicking against the walkway like a warning drum. Then, as the front door shut behind her, I felt a tiny spark of mischief ignite. I had weathered Karen's complaints before about my mailbox, my hedges, even my Halloween decorations, but this was personal, and, frankly, a little funny. Later that day, while Karen was busy drafting angry emails to the HOA board, I walked down to the spring. I let the water flow freely, watching it trickle into a channel I had built for irrigation. An idea began forming, playful and perfectly harmless, yet utterly satisfying. If Karen wanted to make a big deal about a few barrels of water, why not show her the true power of a little spring water? As I mapped out the path of the water through my yard, I imagined Karen's reaction. The plan wasn't about revenge, it was about irony, about turning her obsession with rules into a lesson she'd never forget. By the time the sun dipped low, the first channels were dug, ready to guide the water wherever I chose. The stage was set, and Karen, unknowingly, had walked straight into the spotlight. The next morning, I could sense that Karen was already on high alert. I spotted her from my kitchen window, clipboard in hand, pacing the sidewalk like a general planning an attack. Every so often, she'd peer into my yard, squinting at my barrels and my spring water channel, as if trying to predict my next move. I poured myself a coffee and smirked. Little did she know, the real fun was just beginning. I spent the morning adjusting the channels and digging a few new paths, making sure the water would flow smoothly but unpredictably. It was like setting up a Rube Goldberg machine, only with water. My plan wasn't destructive, it was theatrical, and the irony was delicious. Karen, who had spent years policing every inch of the neighborhood, was about to get a first-hand lesson in how water doesn't follow rules. By mid-afternoon, I filled the final barrel. Watching as the clear, cool spring water poured over the rocks and through the channels, I imagined Karen storming over again, ready to wag her finger, only to find herself at the mercy of the very thing she'd been policing. A soft chuckle escaped me as I thought about her face. Then came the first signs that she suspected something. A subtle glance toward my yard, a sharp inhale as if she smelled mischief in the air. I kept calm, pretending to prune a bush, my hands working mechanically while my mind raced through the sequence I had planned. It was about timing, precision, and patience. By late afternoon, I noticed Karen moving faster than usual, her pace frantic as she muttered under her breath about illegal water hoarding and community violations. It was almost an art form watching her unravel. I decided to escalate just a little. I opened a small valve that connected to barrels, and a gentle stream of water began flowing along a new channel, carefully directed toward the edge of her lawn. I stayed inside, sipping my coffee, pretending to water my plants, while secretly monitoring the progress. The water traveled slowly at first, snaking its way past my garden beds and flower pots, glinting in the sunlight like a mischievous ribbon. I could imagine Karen noticing it any second and launching into her usual tirade. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I realized I had done enough for the first act. Karen hadn't noticed a thing yet, but soon enough, she would. And when she did, well, that's when the fun would truly begin. I leaned back against the counter smiling, knowing that patience was part of the plan. By evening, the neighborhood had quieted down, the street empty except for Karen, who was now pacing near her porch steps, muttering about neighbors who don't follow the rules. Little did she know, her obsession with my spring water had made her the perfect target for a little liquid irony. The next morning, Karen was already out on her porch, scanning my yard like a hawk. Her expression was somewhere between suspicion and fury, and I couldn't help but grin from behind my curtains. Today, the real fun would begin. I made sure the spring water channels were clear and ready. Every little twist and turn had been meticulously planned, ensuring that the flow would move exactly where I wanted it, but without causing any real damage. It was artistry disguised as mischief. I opened a secondary valve, letting a small stream of water slip into a channel that led gently toward her side of the property. At first it was subtle, a thin ribbon of water snaking across the edge of her lawn. But Karen, of course, noticed immediately. Her eyes widened and she pointed an accusing finger in my direction. What is this?" she shouted, stomping down her porch steps. I leaned on my fence, pretending to be engrossed in my tulips. She stormed closer, heels digging into the grass, and I could hear her muttering under her breath about illegal irrigation and community violation codes. I stayed perfectly calm, sipping my coffee, letting her frustration build like a slow crescendo. Then, with perfect timing, I released the final valve. A small but steady stream of water gushed from the barrels, flowing through the channel I'd prepared and spilling over the very edge of her property. The trickle became a tiny stream, and the stream became a miniature river, cutting through the soil and teasing the edges of her meticulously trimmed garden. Karen's jaw dropped. She tried to stomp it back, to divert the flow with a shovel, but the water was faster than her fury. It twisted around flower beds, dodged her attempts to block it, and gleamed in the morning sunlight as if mocking her. I could barely contain my laughter. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some chuckling quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's face was turning bright red, a mix of anger and helplessness. Every stump she took only splashed her further, and the water, clever as ever, seemed to find the path of least resistance directly toward her feet. By the time she finally realized that the stream wasn't going to stop, she was soaked up to her knees. Her perfectly pressed skirt clung to her legs and her clipboard, once a symbol of authority, floated uselessly in the shallow water. She shrieked and waved her arms, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, but it was too late. The Springwater had claimed its victory. I leaned back on my fence, smiling and shaking my head. Karen had underestimated the power of a little water and a lot of patience. This wasn't about revenge. It was about irony, about letting someone obsessed with rules experience the unpredictability of nature. And nature, it seemed, had a sense of humor. By the next morning, Karen was fuming. Her clothes were still damp from yesterday's mishap, and her hair was in wild disarray. Evidence of the small Springwater attack she had suffered. But that didn't stop her from storming over to my yard with renewed determination. This time she had a plan, or at least, she thought she did. Armed with her trusty clipboard and a garden hose she had dragged from the shed, Karen attempted to block the channels with bricks, boards, and even flower pots. She stomped, shoved, and muttered rules about illegal water diversion and property damage. Meanwhile, I leaned on my fence, casually sipping my coffee, enjoying every moment of the spectacle. The water, however, had other ideas. As soon as Karen tried to divert the flow, it found a new path, twisting around her obstacles and bypassing her defenses. Every time she blocked one channel, another would open, guiding the water toward her in an almost playful manner. She stomped and waved, but the Springwater was relentless. Neighbors had begun to gather, peeking from behind curtains and over fences, some whispering excitedly, others laughing quietly. I could hear snippets of conversation. "Is she serious? I can't believe this is happening. She's going to get soaked again." The neighborhood was witnessing a rare spectacle. Karen being bested by a little barrel of Karen's frustration reached a fever pitch. In her haste, she didn't notice a secondary channel I had dug the night before, one that led water toward the side of her porch. With a sudden gush, the Springwater surged, splashing over her shoes and up her skirt. She shrieked, flailing to regain her balance. But it was too late. The water had claimed another victory. By now, her hands were dripping, her clipboard nearly ruined, and her hair plastered to her forehead. She tried to storm back inside, but the water, cheeky and unstoppable, found its way under her porch steps, turning her retreat into another wet adventure. I couldn't stop my laughter, though I tried to look innocent and detached. Finally she paused, breathing heavily, trying to regain composure. This is unacceptable," she yelled. "You're breaking every HOA rule in the book." I smiled, tilting my head. "Funny," I said, "because all I'm doing is using the water that flows naturally on my property." Her face went from red to purple. She opened her mouth to argue, but I had already retreated inside, leaving her to glare at the channels while the water continued its playful course. It was a small, harmless victory, but a victory nonetheless. Karen had underestimated patience, planning, and the unpredictability of nature. As I watched her stomp back to her porch, dripping and defeated, I realized that this wasn't just about pretty water, it was about perspective. Karen had spent years enforcing rules without understanding context, and now, ironically, she was learning that some things like water can't be controlled, no matter how rigid the rules. By the next morning, Karen was already plotting her counterattack. She had spent the night researching HOA regulations, online gardening forums, and even YouTube videos about water diversion. In her mind, she was ready to reclaim her authority and finally put an end to my Springwater rebellion. I could see her from my kitchen window, pacing her porch and muttering to herself, occasionally pointing at my yard as if willing the water to stop. I took my time preparing my morning coffee, enjoying the calm before the next storm, though in this case, the storm was entirely metaphorical, at least, for now. Karen returned armed with new tools, a garden hose, nozzle, a rake, and an assortment of heavy-duty tarps she had pinned together in an attempt to redirect the water. Her determination was palpable. She approached the edge of my property with careful precision, inspecting the channels, measuring distances, and muttering about liability and illegal diversion. I stepped outside casually, carrying a small watering can, pretending to tend to my plants while secretly watching her every move. Karen's plan seemed elaborate, but I had anticipated it. I'd spent the past week preparing multiple channels, each with a slight incline that guided the water in unpredictable ways. Any attempt to control it would only make things more interesting. As she began laying out her tarp barriers, I opened a small valve on the barrels. The water flowed gently at first, almost hesitantly, before finding a small gap in the tarp. In an instant, it turned into a mischievous little stream, slithering like a live creature toward her feet. Karen gasped, stepping back, but the tarp redirected the flow in a new direction again toward her side of the yard. Her frustration mounted. "This is impossible," she shouted. "I am officially reporting you to the HOA." Her voice trembled, both with anger and the faint dread of wet shoes and soggy hems. Neighbors had begun to peek out of their windows again, sensing another dramatic showdown. Some whispered, others stifled laughter, but all eyes were on Karen and my little Springwater contraption. Karen tried everything, blocking channels with bricks, stomping on the flowing water, even trying to redirect it with her rake butt. Every effort failed. The water, gentle but insistent, continued its playful march toward her, curling around obstacles, trickling under the top, and teasing her at every turn. By mid-afternoon, Karen was drenched from the knees down, her clipboard soaked and practically useless. Her hair clung to her face, and her expression was a perfect mixture of horror and disbelief. I stood back, pretending to water my plants, though my grin betrayed me. It wasn't mean-spirited. It was poetic justice, nature's subtle reminder that some things can't be dictated by rules. Finally, Karen gave a defeated groan and stomped back toward her porch. The water had won today, not in a destructive way, but in sheer, playful persistence. I leaned on my fence, sipping my coffee, already anticipating tomorrow's moves. This battle wasn't over, but for now, the Springwater had claimed another small, glorious victory. By the following morning, it was clear that Karen wasn't giving up. She emerged from her house like a storm cloud, drenched yet determined, clutching a notebook filled with diagrams, sketches, and what appeared to be contingency plans for every possible water diversion. Her hair was still damp from the previous day's fiasco, but her glare was sharper than ever. I stood in my yard, casually tending to my tulips, pretending to be utterly absorbed in my gardening while keeping a careful eye on her. Karen had clearly upgraded her strategy. Today, she wasn't just planning to stomp or block the water, she had a full-blown operation in mind. Armed with buckets, hoses, and a small portable pump, she marched to the edge of my property and began laying out her defenses with meticulous care. Every channel, every potential flow point, seemed to be accounted for, or so she thought. I silently counted the twists and turns she didn't anticipate, each one a small victory waiting to happen. As she worked, I opened a hidden valve, releasing a controlled surge of Springwater into the main channel. The water moved deliberately, slipping past her barricades in ways she hadn't considered. At first, it trickled, teasing her as she stomped and adjusted her hoses. Then it picked up momentum, curling around the edges of her tarp and pooling near her feet. Karen shrieked, startled, and waved her rake in desperation. This is illegal. You're breaking the law," she cried, although anyone watching could see the absurdity of her drenched outfit, the soaked clipboard, and the impossible angles of the water's path. Neighbors peered out of windows, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I decided to step up the spectacle. Opening another valve, I let a gentle stream of water snake around a flower bed, then curve in a way that sent a small splash straight toward her shoes. She jumped back, losing her balance, sending a bucket of water tipping over onto the tarp she had so carefully laid. In seconds, she was knee-deep in water again, and her carefully planned defenses were ruined. Karen's face went from red to purple as she tried to regain control. "You're impossible. This is harassment," she yelled, her voice quivering with anger and frustration. I leaned on my fence, smiling innocently, letting her flail. There was a rhythm to this now, the dance of water and Karen. Chaos and rules, patience and fury. After nearly an hour of battling the flow, Karen finally threw her hands up in defeat. She stomped back toward her porch, drenched and defeated once more, muttering about HOA complaints, bylaws, and neighbors who encouraged this behavior. The water, meanwhile, continued to move as if nothing had happened, quietly reclaiming its channels. I couldn't help but laugh softly. Karen's obsession with control had met its match in a simple spring and a few cleverly designed channels. Today's victory wasn't flashy, but it was satisfying, the kind of poetic justice that doesn't need to be loud to be effective. As I watched her retreat, I realized that Karen had become part of the spectacle itself, the unwitting star in a story that only my Springwater could tell. And tomorrow, the next chapter would begin. By midweek, Karen's obsession had reached new heights. She wasn't just planning counterattacks anymore, she was recruiting allies. From her porch, she made frantic calls to neighbors, the HOA board, and anyone who would listen about the Springwater crisis in the neighborhood. Her voice carried across the street, a mix of panic and authority, warning everyone about my illegal water hoarding. I watched from my yard, amused and curious. It was fascinating how quickly Karen had escalated from solo fury to full-blown community mobilization. I took a slow sip of my coffee and surveyed my channels. Everything was ready. Each stream of water flowed exactly where I wanted, and the new twists I had added overnight made her potential interference nearly impossible. Soon, a small group of neighbors appeared, peeking cautiously over fences and around corners. Karen waved at them dramatically, pointing at the water as if it were a crime scene. "See this," she said, voice cracking with urgency. "This is unacceptable. We must stop it before it ruins our property values." The neighbors exchanged glances, some hiding smiles, others quietly observing, unsure whether to intervene. I pretended not to notice them, casually pruning a bush, letting the tension build. Karen, sensing their attention, stomped down the walkway, trying to maintain her commanding presence, but she was soaked again from the channels that snaked unpredictably near her steps. Her desperation was palpable. She tried to block the water with boards and buckets, yelling instructions at the neighbors, who were too hesitant or too amused to help. The spring water, however, was clever. It flowed around obstacles, curling under tops and bypassing even the most desperate attempts to control it. Each splash that landed near Karen's feet seemed almost intentional, a gentle reminder that nature couldn't be bullied. Karen's shouts grew louder. "This is outrageous. I am the HOA, you will be fined. This is harassment." Her words rang through the neighborhood, echoing against the houses and yards, while I stayed perfectly calm. I could hear the neighbors quietly whispering to each other, some stifling laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the spectacle. Finally, Karen paused, dripping wet, her hair plastered to her face, and stomped her foot in frustration. The spring water continued its playful course, gently but persistently flowing along her property line, reclaiming every channel she tried to block. I leaned on my fence, smiling, realizing that she had become the unwitting star of a story that was quickly spreading through the street. As she muttered complaints into her phone, plotting HOA meetings and writing emails, I sipped my coffee and prepared for the next day. Karen had escalated, and that meant I had to escalate too. The battle wasn't just about water anymore, it was about patience, creativity, and turning her obsession into a lesson she wouldn't forget. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the day she realized just how unstoppable a little spring water could be. And by then, I had a few more surprises in store. By the following morning, Karen was a force of sheer determination and soaked fury. She emerged from her house with a long list of HOA rules, a clipboard that had seen better days, and a newfound strategy that involved barricades, hoses, and, from what I could tell, sheer willpower. Her eyes narrowed at my yard, scanning every channel as if plotting a military campaign. I strolled outside, watering can in hand, pretending to be engrossed in my tulips while secretly enjoying the tension crackling in the air. Karen had clearly been busy overnight, adding extra boards, bricks, and tops to her arsenal. But I had spent the evening rerouting a few channels, creating new twists and turns, making her defenses practically useless before she even attempted them. Karen wasted no time. She stomped down the walkway, dragging hoses and waving her rake like a general issuing commands. "I will not be defeated by water," she shouted, though the faint trickle running around her feet told a different story. She tried to redirect the flow with her top barriers, but each adjustment seemed to only anger the spring water further, sending tiny splashes toward her shoes and dampening her already soaked skirt. A few curious neighbors had gathered, peeking from behind curtains and over fences. Some whispered, some laughed quietly, and some shook their heads in disbelief. It was becoming a neighborhood spectacle. Karen, oblivious to the amused audience, stomped and flailed, trying every tactic she could think of, blocking channels, lifting hoses, even attempting to catch the water with buckets. But the spring water was relentless. It flowed round obstacles, found hidden paths, and curved perfectly toward the edges of her property. One mischievous little stream even climbed over the edge of her porch, splashing her ankles as she tried to stomp it back. Her face twisted with frustration, the picture of someone losing control to a force far smaller than herself. At one point, she turned to the neighbors for help, gesturing wildly. "Do you see this?" she demanded, voice cracking. "This is harassment. It's illegal. You have to stop it." The neighbors exchanged glances, some stifling laughter, others simply shaking their heads. Nobody moved. She was alone in her battle, facing not just me, but the unstoppable, playful persistence of a little By midday, Karen was soaked from head to toe. Her hair stuck to her face, her clipboard was ruined, and her carefully planned defenses had collapsed entirely. She muttered about filing reports, calling the HOA, and even taking legal action. But the water kept flowing, indifferent to her threats. I leaned against my fence, sipping my coffee and shaking my head with a smile. Karen had escalated, certainly, but so had I each day. The battle had become a delicate dance, a lesson in patience, planning, and the unpredictable nature of life. And in this little neighborhood feud, the Springwater had proven to be the cleverest, most persistent participant of all. By midweek, Karen's obsession had reached a fever pitch. She emerged from her house with her hair still damp, her clothes clinging stubbornly from previous encounters with the Springwater, and a glare that could melt concrete. Today, she wasn't just angry, she was desperate. I watched her from my kitchen window as she carried a new set of tools, extra tarps, buckets, a garden hose, and, inexplicably, a small folding chair that seemed intended to give her a vantage point. Her eyes scanned my yard like a general planning an invasion, and I couldn't help but admire her commitment, if not her judgment. I stepped outside casually, watering can in hand, pretending to fuss with my tulips while carefully observing Karen's movements. She began laying out her new defenses with meticulous precision, positioning boards and tarps along the channels, muttering to herself about blocking every possible path and restoring order. But the Springwater had other plans. It flowed gently at first, teasing the edges of her new barricades, curling around the boards she placed, slipping past the top corners she tried to secure. Each splash toward her feet seemed almost deliberate, and I could see her frustration mounting with every careful adjustment. Karen shouted, "This is impossible. I've blocked every channel." She stomped in the water, trying to redirect it with her rake, but the clever twists I had added to the channels overnight made her efforts futile. The stream found its way around every obstacle, flowing past her defenses and splashing onto the edges of her porch. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered again, peeking curiously from behind fences and hedges. Some whispered, some giggled, and a few recorded the spectacle on their phones. Karen's rage was becoming entertainment, and she seemed oblivious to the fact that her own obsession with control was now on display for the entire block. At one point she lost her balance, slipping slightly in the shallow water. Her chair toppled over, landing with a splash, and she flailed, trying to regain composure. Water seeped into her shoes, soaked the hems of her skirt, and clung to her hair. Her face was red, a mix of fury and humiliation, while the Springwater continued its playful course unabated. I leaned against my fence, sipping my coffee, relishing the irony. Karen had escalated her tactics, yet the result was the same. She was completely at the mercy of a little Springwater. There was no malice in my actions, just careful planning, patience, and a subtle reminder that some forces, like water, can't be dictated by rules or authority. By the end of the day, Karen had retreated to her porch, dripping, defeated, and muttering threats about HOA complaints and legal action. Meanwhile, the water continued to flow freely along the channels, reclaiming its paths and proving once again that persistence and clever design could triumph over obsession and control. By the next morning, Karen had clearly reached the end of her patience. She emerged from her house like a storm cloud, soaked from the previous day's escapades but armed with renewed determination. Today, she intended to end the Springwater saga once and for all, or at least, that was her plan. She carried a toolbox, multiple hoses, and what appeared to be a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned my yard, calculating angles, slopes, and the paths of the channels. I watched from my porch, pretending to prune a bush, but secretly relishing the anticipation of the coming showdown. Karen approached the edge of my property with military precision, shouting at imaginary allies or perhaps at the neighborhood in general about the unlawful water diversion and community hazards. She stomped her feet, brandished her rake, and began laying down her plastic sheeting in an attempt to block and redirect the water. But I had prepared a new twist overnight. A hidden channel, previously unnoticed, now carried water along a clever curve that led straight toward the edge of her porch. When I opened a small valve, the water surged playfully along its path, slipping beneath her top, curling around the edges of her boards, and splashing directly onto her shoes. Karen shrieked, trying to stomp it back, but the water seemed to anticipate her every move. Each step she took to block a channel created a new opening, and soon, she was splashing through the miniature stream like a hapless actor in her own drama. The neighbors had gathered again, quietly watching, some stifling laughter, others shaking their heads at the sheer absurdity. Determined to reclaim control, Karen dragged buckets into position, trying to catch the flowing water and redirect it. She tipped one too far, spilling half of its contents onto herself. Another bucket slipped from her grasp, creating a small cascade that flowed directly toward her ankles. Her face was red, her hair plastered to her forehead, and her skirt clung to her legs. She was defeated yet again, and the water continued to move as if mocking her. I leaned casually against the fence, sipping my coffee, letting the scene unfold. Karen's obsession with rules, control, and appearances had met its match in a simple, persistent force of nature. There was no malice in my actions, only carefully orchestrated irony. By midday, she retreated to her porch, dripping and exhausted, muttering about fines, HOA meetings, and legal recourse. The water, however, showed no sign of stopping. It flowed through the channels as if it had a mind of its own, reclaiming paths, curling around obstacles, and teasing anyone who dared to interfere. As I watched Karen muttering and dripping, I smiled. The battle had escalated, certainly, but it had also become a neighborhood spectacle, a lesson in patience, persistence, and the playful unpredictability of nature. And tomorrow, I thought, would be the day she realized just how unstoppable Springwater could really be. By the next morning, Karen had clearly moved into full-scale escalation mode. She emerged from her house, soaked hair plastered to her forehead and clothes clinging uncomfortably, carrying a backpack stuffed with what looked like miniature barricades, spray bottles, and a roll of duct tape. Her clipboard was now a soggy mess, but she held it as if it were her badge of authority. From my porch, I watched her carefully. Over the past days, I had mapped every inch of the yard and refined the channels so that the water would flow unpredictably yet harmlessly, wherever I wanted it. Karen's increased determination was impressive but ultimately futile. She began laying out a labyrinth of boards, tarps, and buckets along the channels, muttering to herself about final measures and absolute control. Every movement was calculated, every step deliberate. She was determined to prove that her obsession with rules and order could triumph over a little I opened a small valve on the main barrel, releasing a gentle surge into the channels. The water moved with playful cunning, curling around her new obstacles, slipping beneath boards, and teasing the edges of her tarp. Karen stomped and waved her rake, trying desperately to redirect the flow, but every move she made seemed to give the water a new route right toward her feet. Her frustration reached a crescendo. She shrieked, "This is harassment. This is unacceptable. I will not stand for this." And yet, every attempt she made to control the water failed spectacularly. One mischievous little stream splashed over the edge of her porch, soaking her ankles. Another snaked under her boards and splashed her from behind. Neighbors had started to gather again, peeking from behind hedges and over fences. Some whispered to each other, others stifled laughter, and a few took out their phones to record the spectacle. Karen seemed oblivious, too absorbed in her own battle to notice the audience she had created. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only half an hour, Karen stood drenched, exhausted, and defeated, muttering about fines, HOA rules, and legal action. The Springwater, as if satisfied with its performance, flowed calmly through the channels, unaffected by her anger and meticulous efforts. I leaned on my fence, smiling, watching her retreat. Karen had escalated, certainly, but the water had proven to be clever, persistent, and unstoppable. Each splash, each twist in the channel, was a reminder that some forces of nature cannot be controlled, no matter how meticulously someone tries. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the final act. Karen had one last chance to reclaim control, or she could finally accept that the Springwater had the upper hand in this little neighborhood feud. The next morning, Karen appeared more determined than ever. She had spent the night scheming, and I could tell from the look in her eyes that today would be her final assault. Armed with buckets, hoses, boards, and even a small wheelbarrow, she marched toward my yard like a general preparing for battle. Her soaked hair stuck to her face, but her expression radiated unwavering determination. I stepped outside casually, watering can in hand, pretending to prune a bush while keeping a close eye on her. Over the past days, I had carefully perfected the channels, adding new twists and subtle slopes that would guide the water in ways she couldn't predict. Today, I would let the water speak for itself. Karen began setting up what she called her ultimate barrier, rows of boards stacked along the main channel, tarps pinned down, buckets strategically placed to catch and redirect the water. She muttered under her breath about final measures and absolute control, clearly expecting victory this time. I opened a hidden valve I had prepared overnight, releasing a steady stream of sticky water at first. It trickled along the edges of her defenses, teasing and testing her patience. Then, with perfect timing, it surged through a previously unnoticed gap in her top, flowing directly toward her ankles. Karen shrieked and stomped, trying to redirect it with her rake. But the water had anticipated her every move, splitting into two streams that bypassed her barriers completely. Neighbors had gathered, peeking over fences and hedges, whispering excitedly and stifling laughter. Karen, oblivious to the audience, stomped and flailed, muttering threats about HOA fines, legal action, and neighbors who encouraged this behavior. Every step she took seemed to create a new opening for the Springwater, which flowed playfully around her boots and splashed her further. At one point, she attempted to pour a bucket of water back into the channel, thinking it would stop the flow. Instead, it overflowed, sending a small cascade directly over her shoes and soaking her skirt. She let out a frustrated wail, slipping slightly in the shallow water, while the stream continued on its merry path. I leaned casually against my fence, smiling, enjoying the culmination of days of planning and patience. Karen had tried every tactic: tubs, boards, buckets, stomped barriers, even the element of intimidation, but none of it mattered. The water was clever, persistent, and unstoppable, and she was the star of her own defeat. By afternoon, Karen had retreated to her porch, soaked, exhausted, and muttering about this neighborhood and uncontrollable residents. The Springwater flowed freely, reclaiming its channels and creating small ripples that glimmered in the sunlight. It was a quiet victory, subtle yet undeniable, the triumph of patience, planning, and a little bit of nature's playful irony. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the day for the grand finale, the final act in this little neighborhood saga where rules, obsession, and water would collide in one unforgettable showdown. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen had been making dramatic announcements from her porch for days, warning neighbors about illegal water diversion and Springwater chaos. Today, though I had a feeling the climax of our little feud was approaching, the water channels were ready, perfectly aligned for the ultimate payoff, and I was ready to let nature take the stage. Karen emerged from her house armed with new tools, hoses, tops, and what appeared to be a large plastic bin she intended to use as a makeshift dam. Her eyes darted across the yard, calculating every angle with the precision of a master planner. She had clearly learned from her previous defeats and intended to win this time. I stepped outside casually, carrying my watering can and pretending to tend to my flowers. The sun glinted off the Springwater barrels, and I felt a thrill of anticipation. Karen began setting up her final defenses, arranging boards and buckets, muttering about HOA rules, fines, and legal recourse. She even shouted instructions to imaginary allies, as if the water itself were plotting against her. Once she was in position, I opened the main valve. A surge of water flowed through the channels, moving faster than before, guided by the slight slopes I had carefully constructed. At first, it trickled around the edges of her barriers, teasing her with its subtle movement. Then, in a perfectly timed rush, the water split, sending streams in two directions, both toward Karen's feet. Karen shrieked, trying to stomp the water back, but it was relentless. One stream splashed over the edge of her porch, soaking her ankles, while the other snaked under her boards, flooding the space around her shoes. Her expressions shifted rapidly from shock to disbelief, then to full-blown fury. Neighbors had gathered, peeking from windows and over fences, whispering excitedly and trying to stifle their laughter. Karen, oblivious to the audience, flailed and shouted, attempting to redirect the water with buckets and hoses. Each effort failed spectacularly as the water followed the path I had prepared, curling around obstacles, teasing her, and proving itself unstoppable. At one point she tried to lift a board to block a channel, only to have a small surge gush under her arm, soaking her completely. Her hair plastered to her face, skirt drenched, and hands trembling with frustration. She finally realized she had lost the battle. She stood dripping, exhausted, and defeated, muttering about fines, HOA complaints, and neighbors who encouraged this madness. I leaned on my fence, smiling and shaking my head. Karen had escalated to her ultimate plan, but it had been no match for patience, preparation, and a little bit of playful Springwater. Today marked the climax of our feud. She had finally faced the unstoppable power of a force she could neither control nor predict. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the denouement, the day when Karen would have to accept the undeniable truth. Springwater always wins. The next morning, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. Karen had stayed inside most of the previous day, dripping and muttering under her breath about fines, HOA meetings, and uncontrollable water. I could tell she was brooding, planning yet another counterattack or perhaps mentally preparing for the inevitable. I stepped outside slowly, carrying my watering can, casually tending to my tulips. The channels were ready, but today I decided to give Karen a break, or at least an opportunity to face reality without further humiliation. A gentle trickle of Springwater flowed through the paths I had carved, sparkling in the morning sunlight like a ribbon of liquid mischief. Karen finally emerged, looking both exhausted and weary. Her hair was still damp, her skirt clinging, and she clutched her clipboard like a shield. She approached the edge of my yard cautiously, as if expecting an ambush from the water itself. This cannot continue," she muttered, her voice trembling slightly. I smiled politely and tilted my head. "Good morning, Karen," I said casually. "It's a beautiful day for the Springwater to flow, don't you think?" Karen huffed and waved her hands in exasperation. I don't know how you're doing this. I've tried everything: hoses, boards, buckets, barriers, and yet the water, it keeps finding a way." I shrugged innocently. "Water is persistent, just like some people. Sometimes it finds its path no matter what obstacles are in the way." For a moment, Karen seemed speechless, standing in the soft trickle of water along her property line. The anger that had fueled her for days was replaced by resignation. She glanced at her soggy shoes, her ruined clipboard, and then at the neat channels guiding the Springwater through my yard. Slowly, she straightened up, muttered something about neighbors and rules, and retreated back to her porch. The battle, it seemed, was finally over. The neighborhood had witnessed the spectacle of HOA obsession meeting the gentle, persistent force of nature. And while Karen may have learned the hard way that some things like Springwater cannot be controlled, the rest of us had been quietly entertained by the poetic justice of it all. I leaned on my fence, watching the water glimmer in the sunlight, flowing freely through its channels. The feud had ended, but the story would linger, whispered about at backyard barbecues and neighborhood gatherings for weeks to come. And somewhere inside, I knew Karen would remember it every time it rained. A week had passed since Karen's last dramatic attempt to control the Springwater, and the neighborhood was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, birds chirped in the distance, and the sunlight danced across the channels I had carved, sending ripples glimmering across the surface. It was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous days. Karen had stayed mostly inside, occasionally peeking out from behind her curtains, her damp hair still clinging stubbornly from her earlier encounters with the water. She no longer shouted, no longer stomped, and no longer waved her rake like a battle standard. In short, she had been defeated not by confrontation or anger, but by persistence, patience, and the subtle power of nature. I tended my garden, filling the barrels with spring water, guiding it gently through the channels I had created. The water flowed freely, curving around rocks, twisting along edges, and disappearing into hidden streams. It was playful, persistent, and unstoppable, much like the lessons Karen had unwittingly learned. Later in the day, I noticed Karen stepping cautiously onto her porch. She watched the water with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. Without a word, she retreated inside, leaving me to my garden. It was a silent acknowledgement of defeat, and strangely, I felt a sense of closure. The feud had run its course, and the Springwater had emerged victorious. Neighbors occasionally passed by, offering polite nods or quiet smiles. Some whispered about the spectacle, others chuckled at the memory of Karen drenched and flailing. It became a story of the neighborhood, a tale of obsession, irony, and the clever triumph of nature over rigid rules. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the yard, I leaned against the fence, sipping a cool glass of Springwater. Karen's shrill protests were now just echoes in memory, replaced by the gentle gurgle of flowing water. It was a small, peaceful victory, but a victory nonetheless. And somewhere in the neighborhood behind closed curtains, Karen would always remember the lesson she had learned. No amount of rules, plans, or authority could control something as simple, beautiful, and unstoppable as Springwater. And for the rest of us, the story would serve as a humorous reminder that sometimes patience, cleverness, and a little playful mischief are more powerful than anger, obsession, or authority. The feud was over. The Springwater had flowed, and Karen had finally been soaked in more ways than one.